Good afternoon, everyone. Mabuhay. Did you have a good day in the Philippines already? Yes. Well, I went for the tuk-tuk ride, which is one way to get taken. But I'm sorry. I'm going to just talk in general about the Philippines. This is a remarkable, I call it a nation of islands, because there are over 7,100, and some, depending on how much you count the rocks, there are only about 2,000 that have inhabitants, though. So we'll just be sailing for days through all these beautiful islands. It's one of the more beautiful seascapes in the world. And a nation that's had such a variety of people come to it and a somewhat turbulent history right up to the present. But I always remember when I first came to the Philippines, I was actually living in Hong Kong, and I took a job as crew on a newly commissioned, very lovely new yacht. And suddenly the captain called us out and said, "We're leaving today." And so we sailed out, and then as we went out of Hong Kong, I saw there were typhoon warnings up. And so we sailed into one of the larger storms of way back when, and we were tossed around and barely survived just because the vessel was brand new and fairly sturdy, but we were 16 days overdue from Hong Kong to Manila, and during that time we had put into a bay for shelter which happened to have President Marcos's country house, which was a big palace near Bataan. And we were boarded by presidential security who proceeded to rob us. And then we had to escape in the middle of the night on a fair breeze to get away from that all. So that was my introduction to the Philippines. I think we won't have those kind of problems on this trip by any means. But this is a very much the maritime country because it's all these different islands stretching, south of Taiwan down toward Borneo, where we just were. This is actually a very the illustration is of all the very earliest civilizations and peoples, and so what they call the Sahin Culture is a name for migrant nomads and hunters that came across the land bridges back in earlier times before the Ice Age. The Philippines, Borneo, and that whole Southeast Asian continent were all connected. So there was a lot of human activity predating any written history. And so the Philippines is sort of an extension out into the sea, which you could have walked to from these other places. Thereby, they have a remnant culture from those prehistoric times in these many different islands. But it's very rugged land, that which it is. And there's an old legend of one of the Luzon people about there was a giant bird that wanted to land but couldn't find any land, and so the sky started throwing mountains into the sea, and the sea became angry and started throwing the mountains back up into the sky, and the bird finally made a peace and told the sky and the sea to just get along, and so then all those islands were formed. And you have, particularly up in Luzon, the biggest island where Manila is, has some very high mountains. Mount Apo is over 4,000 meters. But most of the islands are fairly low with a peak in them, and then some are volcanic. There's some 23 active volcanoes, but a lot of the land was made out of the collision of the tectonic plates on the ring of fire that stretches up to Japan and all the way to the Americas, of course. And of course, we're down on that island, Palawan, down there, which is a very unusual island just because it's so long and mountainous. You see pretty big mountains just up here. Then we're going to go now up to Coron and then Romblon in the Visayas group, up into central seas of the Sibuyan Sea, they call that area. And then we'll continue up to Manila, up in Luzon. So this is just a closer look at where we are. Palawan, Puerto Princess. Mindanao is the big island to the east and south of the Philippines. And so each island actually has its own subgroups of people, often its own language. And then there's the national culture of the Philippines, which is, of course, mostly emanated out of Luzon and the Metro Manila, they call it. The island of Romblon is just below this, but there's other islands. You may have heard of north of Panay. There's an island called Boroque, which It got rated as the most beautiful island in the world for diving and relaxing. And so it's a sort of a very large spit of sand in the sea, but it had so many visitors that last year the Philippine government closed it down because they couldn't handle the overflow of people that were wanting to go to that island in particular and send people to other islands. And when I came here as a sailor, I continued after my rescue, I would say. Oh, by the way, we sailed into that typhoon because when we got to Manila finally, the Marine police came out and arrested the captain for stealing the boat. And we were released. I had another boat, and then I went sailing down to Cebu, which is in the center of this illustration. And I was flipped over, I was marooned, I was rescued, and I was really impressed by the hospitality of the Filipino people. And I remember landing on one island, and I was greeted and helped out. And I remember one of the elders of the community said, "Don't leave, because you can have any woman you want as long as you stay. And in fact, you can have all the women if you'll just stay." That's another question. Well, here's Luzon up there, and Manila in the big Manila Bay, and then the highly mountainous north of Ilocos, the province up there, which is then going up toward the island of Taiwan, not off the chart here. But Luzon is very rugged like this, and it's had for thousands of years farmers who have cut terraces. So this is one of the sites up there. People living in such rugged hillsides still will produce rice. And here's one of the, let's say, pre-Christian fertility gods overlooking those rice fields up there. And a lot of the people up in the high mountains are, again, of origins that predate history, predate the mixture of the modern Filipino nation. Very much of a variety of influences and cultures. But the land itself, they're big forests. Now, unfortunately, the Philippines has lost almost 90% of its forests. It has been endlessly deforested, causing erosions and degradation of the environment. Now they have some national parks, like this is also in Luzon, Lake Taal, with this big, beautiful former volcanic crater. And there's a lot of hot springs and natural features of the geology through the various islands, but especially in Luzon, where you have this great Mount Mayon, which is one of the active volcanoes and has been called the perfect cone, along with Mount Fuji, perhaps. But this, you may remember, blew up in 1991, Mount Pinatubo, which is north of Manila, and that was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in modern history and heard around the world. Well, we have just been in Palawan. We're on our way out of Honda Bay, and we're going to go up past the Coyo Islands up into the central Visaya area. I won't go on about it, but some of you maybe went on the trip through the river, or you went to the beach. I mean, Palawan is famous for its natural beauty and the cleanliness of its island, because it doesn't have that many people nor that much industry other than tourism now, and subsistence fishing and a life that is much simpler than out there in the big cities up to the north. I particularly like these. These are called bangkas, these almost spider-like boats with the outriggers that they used to have sails. Now they're all fitted with an outboard, so they're zipping around. But there's a lot of living off the sea, of course, here. And then going into the mountains and the places, we'll have some of this in Coron, where we're going tomorrow, where there are all these islets and saltwater lagoons they will call a lake. And this is, again, a dive paradise and a recreational opportunity for water sports. There's also a lot of these the mountains are karst formations with a lot of caves. Now, you may have gone in the one today. There's another one in Palawan called the Tabon Cave, where they have found the oldest remains of any humans going back 28,000 years. Evidence of that migration that came across the land bridges. This is Tabon Cave, where you can go in. But there are probably many more that will be discovered as they continue to go spelunking and digging around and in the deep here. You went on this trip through the underground river, which is world famous, of course. And when the Spanish came, this whole area was contested. Now, in ancient times, there were always little local rajas, they would call them, and they had their own island, their own kingdom, and there's a long history of them fighting, actually taking slaves from other islands, and so this was often, in spite of the appearances of the land, a very often a violent place. And this is a Spanish fort built in 1818 to try to defend from pirates, and also from the great competitor at that time were the Dutch, and then the English, and and also the Sultanate of Brunei, where we were. And this was part of that general kingdom. As I showed earlier, it is now reduced to the bit of a kingdom that it is now. But these were waters that were contested, and so there were many battles in all these areas over the centuries. Well, this was my pick of the day as we came in this morning. That's the cathedral right down Puerto Princess, with the new Cathedral of Towers of Commerce over it. So I just threw that in just for fun. We'll be here tomorrow, Coron. And that's a small town. There isn't really that much to do, not nearly as big as where we just left. But again, it's a place where some of us will go scuba diving or snorkeling, or just going around in the traditional boats and all these many little islands with their beautiful clear waters and abundant fish life. Now, this is an area where they have preserved the reefs, and the fishing has been limited, whereas much of the Philippines, they've had a serious problem with local people using either industrial poisons to get fish out of the reefs, or they actually take dynamite and bomb the reefs. And so this is, I saw on a bus today that no more fish bombing, because that's, let's say, the worst thing you can do to a marine environment, just to destroy it for an evening's meal. But if you're a diver, snorkeler, you'll see all kinds of things. This is a kind of a sea slug. Oh, and there's a wide variety, and moray eel, all kinds of coral and things like this. But you can see all this for yourself if you go out on one of the trips in under the water. Lots of sharks. Whale sharks are particularly known to feed in these areas. And then the people, as we've already seen, many of them are living literally on the water with the stilts and in their boats. And there's a group called the Bagwe, who are just south in the Sulu Sea, who are renowned for their ability to dive underwater. They can go down almost 5 minutes to go spearfishing under the water, and then they come up. And the kids like this are just trained to be naturally in the water and to be adapted to the environment. So we'll have a taste of that. We went to the market today, and there was all kinds of different fish and squids and things that were for sale, but I was impressed by how small all of the fish are. They've because of the population pressure, the fish are getting down to just the small fry. And that's a serious problem for the Philippines, which continues to have a booming population. Well, hopefully there'll be a balance on this someday, and the people will not have the hardships that are imminent because of just the pressure on the sea. And one of the big businesses now, of course, is tourism, and all these beautiful beaches now have more and more resorts and crowds, and that's become an alternative industry other than subsistence fishing and farming. But again, you can go out and find your own island. You can even name it after yourself. Well, we'll be going to Romblon, right there in the center of this group in the Sibuyan Sea. And that's a rugged island again. It has high mountains in the very center of it, but it's mostly famous for its marble work. Again, this volcanic formation of these islands created certain mineral deposits. This is marble. Philippines also has gold and copper, and it's one of its industries is mining. I have a friend who is a designer for marbleware, and he came from the United States, and he's ended up living in Romblon. I'm going to go out to his factory and see what he's making these days, but that's one of the major industries in Romblon. So you can see these in the shops. Of course, they're a little heavy for your handbag home, but this is sort of the Asian version of Carrara, where they'll cut them and use them for buildings and construction too. And if you go up in the mountains, you have waterfalls and forests, preserves, and so this again is a place where people go for a natural experience. I don't know if you saw this today out there. One of the famous birds of this area is called the Palawan Peacock, and this is a small bird, not as big as some of the other Indian-style peacocks, but it's now protected, but it was hunted for its beautiful blue feathers like this, and it's actually the symbol of the city of Puerto Princesa. There's also a one of the world's biggest eagles lives in the southern Philippines, the Philippine Sea Eagle, which is bigger than the bald eagle even in North America. It can have a wingspan of about 7 feet, and it's almost 3 feet long in its body. They were also hunted, and now they're protected, and they have some reserves for them. But they're islands where they are sort of the lord of the island, overseeing what's left of the other wildlife. Now, because of the island nature of the Philippines, there are no large fauna. There are no orangutans or rhinoceros or elephants or anything like that, but there's a great variety of very small mammals and, of course, lots of snakes and things. This is the Philippine tarsier, which is a nocturnal animal, and you can see from its eyeballs it sort of just woke up. And but you won't see them in the wild. Sometimes they're captured as pets. And there's a variety of monkeys, but again, no large animals in the Philippines. Maybe because it's always been a very rough place to live because of this phenomena. It is right in the center of the Western Pacific typhoon belt. So this kind of a hurricane develops out in Micronesia and then comes in every year. I mean, you've seen it in the paper. Another massive hurricane, or I'm sorry, typhoon they call it. That's from the Chinese name of the Great Wind. The typhoon will come and just smash into the Philippines. And so sort of like we are used to in the Caribbean, suddenly all the trees lose their leaves and the animals are decimated, and then they grow back, but then they get hit again, and it's getting worse and worse. This is a few years ago, Hurricane Haiyan. And if they don't hit the Philippines, they go up and hit the China coast or hit Japan, but they don't go down to Borneo, and that's why the Borneo had the name of South of the Wind, because it never had typhoons down just south of here where we just were. But this creates terrible devastation every year, and so the death toll and the destruction of property is sort of a regular occurrence that then adds to the impoverishment of many of the Filipino people. The whole islands will get sucked and take years and years to rebuild. But that's part of the resilience of the Philippines. They do go on in spite of all this. I'm going to go back into a bit of history. This is the earliest written record of these islands, and it is on a copper plate that was found in Luzon, and it dates about 900 AD. But what's curious about it is that it's written in a kind of a form of language like Cambodian. It's a phonetic script that perhaps was derivative from Sanskrit originally, but it's evidence that there were traders here going back so far, crossing the South China Sea, and the Philippines had visitors from Asia for hundreds, if not thousands of years after the initial settlement. And so there were trading empires that would come, and this is a stamp for a document, again in that early form of phonetic writing, which is now extinct. But other evidence of, let's say, the cross-pollination of the cultures is this game called Sungka, which is a counting game, sort of like scribbage. But it's said to have came from India originally, then ended up being played in Southeast Asia, and then it ended up in the Philippines. And it's before the video games, that's what the kids used to do. This is a piece of pottery that was excavated in Palawan, and it's perhaps about 2,000 years old, but it's famous for this boat up on the top. The handle is actually a small boat with people in it. Evidence of, again, the maritime trade that was how these areas were settled, and their trade goods would go back and forth, especially to China. So the other written records of these islands were in Chinese from the Song Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, that what they called Ma Yi. This island group had all kinds of valuable timbers, exotic animals, birds, things like that. Same sort of trade that was done with Borneo in exchange for silk and porcelains and other manufactured goods from China. So that meant that the Philippines always had a Chinese merchant class that have either been visiting or residents, and this is true to this day. Much of it mixed in now. But all that kind of trade always engendered our favorite topic, piracy. And so here's an early European illustration of one of the known pirates with that. Notice that there's a big cannon in the front of it. So this was again, another Chinese invention, gunpowder, which has made the world much more fun. But they plagued these waters, and so it was always very dangerous to go any farther, and also you had to defend yourself against the pirates. And the city of Manila was originally a stockaded compound in the bay, on the river, Pasig River, just to defend against the pirates who were always coming and trying to steal whatever they could. And just today, again, if you went to that war museum, if you went in the farthest back room, there was the Philippines section, and I saw, anybody saw this, there was the statue of a woman called Silveria, however you pronounce that. And her village was attacked by pirates, but she got so angry, she was about to give birth, and she was pregnant, full-term pregnant, and she picked up her thresher, whatever you call it, an agricultural tool, and chased the pirates back to the boats and scared them all away. So the rule of a pirate, don't bother a pregnant woman, she may call you the father. Anyway, then the Malay traders came from the Malay Peninsula. Of course, Arab traders had come and set up mosques and trade in South China back in the 8th century. Then they came down through Indonesia, Borneo. This is the oldest mosque in the Philippines, which actually is unusual because it's built like a Chinese temple. So it was probably imam that came from Guangdong province in China and came down on the trade routes and then built a mosque. The islands where we are to the east, Mindanao and a number of the other ones, are majority Muslim, and that's been a conflict in the Philippines to this day. Well, and then the modern era began when this rather dour-looking sailor sailed around the world. Well, he didn't make it. He died on his way. Magellan came through in 1521 on his voyage, and he thought he had successfully found his way across the Pacific, however desperate the trip was. And he came to Cebu Island in the center of the Visayan group here, where he declared the King of Spain would be the new ruler, and he baptized and converted the local King Honobon to Catholicism, Christianity, and that began the transformation of the Philippine Islands to be the only nation in Asia which has a majority Christian population, other than the little island of former Portuguese island of Timor to the south. But the Philippines have about 80% Christians now, but 20% or so is Muslims. And it's a very religious country dating from this time. They say about 30% of the Filipinos go to Mass regularly. Well, this was, let's say, the ultimate conflict of cultures, because the Magellan's voyage, and especially the Spanish colonial rule, actively went out to convert the heathens and pagans. And so in this illustration, you see the armed conquistadores fighting the local people if they did not submit and become subjects of the Spanish crown, but above all, a Christian. And Magellan himself, as some historians have said, his fatal mistake, he went from a mere explorer and a business-minded fellow to become a missionary, and he tried to convert the nearby islanders called Mactan Island, who refused, and then they dared him to come ashore, which he did in all of his armor. But the tide was out and the ship was away, the guns couldn't shoot therefore, and Magellan himself was killed right there on the beach and became a martyr to his own cause. Well, the chieftain who led the resistance is called Lapu-Lapu, and he's a national hero to this day. However, it worked out so that if you notice a Philippine policeman's badge, it always has his picture on it, as if you better watch out because Lapu-Lapu will come and get you. And when the Philippines was named after King Philip of Spain, later nationalists in the Philippines wanted to call it Lapu-Lapu land instead. Well, Magellan is remembered in Cebu. He has a big memorial, and he, at the cathedral, left a cross and also a little Virgin Mary in the cathedral. And so this is still here today in the legacy of that great explorer. At the time, it was a conflict between Portugal and Spain who would rule Asia and have access to all the Spice Islands. So the Philippines was named after King Felipe, that with his Habsburg scowl, and he assigned Don Miguel Lopez de Lascaspi, who was a Mexican official, or rather a Spanish official in Mexico, and then the Philippines were considered a province of Mexico throughout the early colonial period, and the galleon trade would come from Mexico bringing silver, and then that would be used to buy silks and porcelain and all kinds of things, and then the galleons would gather in Manila and then go back. It was quite a treacherous trip. Here's another early Spanish illustration of these towering mountains and seas, and must have been pretty frightening at the time. But they settled island by island, putting down rebellions, baptizing the local people that would, and then administering a kind of tried to control this vast area. And you can imagine it was a pretty dangerous place with very few people, and you were very far from home. But slowly it was settled. All these towns, if you go to all the islands, they'll usually have a classical Spanish center around the cathedral, administrative building. So that's one of the pleasures of coming to the Philippines. You can, wink and you think you're somewhere in Spain, and many of the names of the people and the towns are also from Spain. But the original people had many subgroups. So the Tagalogs in Luzon are still, let's say, the largest group, and that's one of the 19 official languages of the Philippines, but considered the general national language. And these are early illustrations of the way they dressed and very elaborate clothing, and they had a lot of gold. One of the Chronicles of Magellan described how the men would wear bells around their waist to attract the women, and the guy who had the best bells won the most girls, I guess. Don't try that on the ship, though. And so the variety of people is really quite remarkable. Now, just as a quick visitor, we are usually in the towns and places where we don't go into the back country to see the other people, but you can see that the red in this that's the Tagalog people, mostly Luzon and northern, and then there's the Ilocanos into the far north, and go all the way down to the Mindanao. You have a whole other language group. And Palawan has its own language called Cuyo, and I was listening to them today, and they were speaking that today, the young people that were our hosts. But if you go into the remote islands, and particularly up in the mountains, you'll find Melanesian, what they call Negritos, which are, again, a remnant population, which you still see down in Papua New Guinea and the larger Melanesian chains in the Pacific. And a lot of them refused to be converted. They ran off into the woods, and they've remained in remnant groups to this day, almost as if everybody's a stranger in their own land. Then there were a lot of people that came across the land bridge, and they are very much like the Montagnards or the what they call Gaoshan people in Taiwan, and these are let's say, the somewhat colorful indigenous people who, again, were neither converted nor suppressed and live in the most remote areas. But now they're vaunted as one of the, let's say, the variety of people in the Philippines, and somewhat celebrated while they are unassimilated. But these are very few. They're less than 1% of the whole population. But they are part of the mix that makes the Philippines so interesting. And especially at festival times, they'll come out and they will be sort of honored, even if they're, let's say, a stranger in this larger world. Well, when the Spanish came, they built their center in Manila on the banks of the river, and they replaced the stockade bamboo fortress that was there with stoneworks and military architecture, and this is still there in central Manila. And this, I mentioned, the galleon trade was the lifeblood of this colony, because they took Philippine wood and built the biggest sail ships of the era, bigger than anything made in Europe, and they patched these up, and then they would go on their annual trip to Acapulco, Mexico, and then they would send whatever they gathered on to Havana, Cuba, and then all the way back to Spain. But these big ships were armed, but they were often preyed upon by either pirates or other European powers. They keep finding more wrecks of them. If they didn't get attacked by the pirate ships, they would often get lost in typhoons. So every few years they find another major find of one of them that sunk off in the seas of the Philippines. But what this trade meant was that the Philippines became an incredibly wealthy place for the few in charge, and so they built Spanish-style cathedrals and buildings, and a lot of them are still around. This is the cathedral in Manila, which is still there. Very elaborate. Many of the buildings have been damaged by earthquakes, because that's another problem. Beyond the volcanoes and the typhoons, the earthquakes do in many buildings. So the style was adapted somewhat to make them almost like a pile of rocks that cannot be destroyed because of all this trouble. And so there's a lot of them are very sturdy. They're not exactly a soaring Gothic style, but they're the pride of many a town like the one we went in today. And in the colonial period, the population was mixed between what they call the peninsulares, the officials sent right from Spain, and then the criollas, who were the Spanish descendants who had been born and raised in the Philippines, and then the mestizos, the name came from the Mexicans, and even Native Americans from Peru and Mexico came over on the Spanish galleon trade to set up their life over in the Philippines as colonists. So this created a certain style of dress that is particularly unique to the Philippines, with these big sleeves called a tenga, that's style. And you can see it in the shops. It's the fanciest dress you could get. And Imelda Marcos was famous for wearing this traditional dress. And so the Philippines sort of continued on when the Mexican Revolution happened, and then all of the South American countries broke off from Spain. That meant that the whole trade was disrupted, and at a certain point the Spanish crown wanted just to sell the Philippines because it was a losing proposition. They didn't earn enough back from it after a couple of centuries. It was the Catholic Church and the Pope who said, no, we need the Philippines to be a Catholic stronghold to spread the faith through Asia. And so the Spanish stayed on, even though they were not a profitable colony, let's say, in the way at the times. But Manila grew as the capital, and it developed a mestizo criollo middle class, educated business people, professionals, doctors, lawyers, etc., who would both be speaking Spanish and Tagalog, and that meant that Manila became the center of some resistance to the Spanish, especially by the young intellectuals and students. This is the founder of the Republic of the Philippines, Dr. Jose Rizal. You'll see his name everywhere. And through his writing, he proclaimed that the Philippines should be an independent country. It had its own land, its own people, and its own economy. They did not need to be under the Spanish anymore. Well, he was arrested for sedition and executed in public. One of his colleagues, Andres Bonifacio, then formed a guerrilla group that then started attacking the Spanish garrisons. So then there was this insurgency that was happening under the nose of the Spanish, after having had the same problem in their colonies in the Americas. And of course the last one was Cuba, that had the same problem at the very same time. And so this was part of the 1880s, 1890s uprising against the increasingly incapable Spanish royal colonial system. So this was one of the original Filipino flag that was raised by the guerrillas to fight the Spanish. And then beginning in Cuba and the Spanish-American War, then the American Navy under General Dewey sailed in and blasted away the Spanish fleet in a total victory by surprise in Manila Bay in 1898. And this meant that, let's say, the new rising power just knocked off the Spanish control there. And the Philippine revolutionaries thought that this would be their independence. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, because the American government at the time was very, let's say, felt its manifest destiny that it's out in the Pacific. It had taken Hawaii. It wanted an outpost out in Asia, where all the other European powers were, let's say, not respecting the local rights so much, particularly the dividing of China. Japan finally took Korea. There were German provinces. The French had Vietnam, and the Dutch had all of the Java, Sumatra, and the Indies. And Germans were in was New Guinea. And so suddenly there was the American imperial power there to join in the game. Now this was precipitated an uprising of the Filipinos. Those ones, the nationalists, couldn't believe that the Americans were just going to replace the Spanish and then come in with their own administration and army. And so there was guerrilla warfare all through the Philippines, which kind of put the, let's say, the American government and especially the press on a bit of a bend. It was almost as if all the ideals to spread civilization were suddenly caught in a swamp, and resistance from the local people. And of course, McKinley and other leaders thought, well, this is our mission to improve the lives of those people over there, whether they wanted to or not. And so American troops were stationed in all of the major cities, and there was a colonial governor, Howard Taft, who that later became president. But everywhere they were met with resistance, and they couldn't stop it. I mean, there's a lot of places and a lot of things they didn't know. The Filipinos were organized by General Emilio Aguinaldo, who again is sort of one of the founders of the country, because he was the one who tried to resist the Americans, but it was, in the end, it was futile. Here's a cartoon of the time where it says Uncle Sam is chasing down Aguinaldo. He's a son of a gun of dodging that he's not worth much when you got him, but I'll get him if it takes all summer. Well, it took many years, and about 100,000 U.S. soldiers' lives, many from malaria and other diseases, but they say about 1 million Filipinos were killed. It was actually a bloodier war than the Spanish had ever had with the locals. And so it was a far away, and most people didn't know about it except by newspaper reports. Their young son would suddenly be off into the Philippines and never come back. And it was one of the first instances of, let's say, modern guerrilla warfare. There were even African-American detachments sent over there to fight the Filipinos, which is a bit of a historical irony. But they were protracted battles. Now, the Filipino insurgents had captured a lot of the Spanish weapons, and so suddenly the Americans were in full-scale battle gear with organized strategies and troops to fight. But it was finally suppressed through, I'd say, extensive brutality, most famously when the General Smith ordered any boy over the age of 10 to be killed. And so there was a lot of massacres. There was also the first recorded instances of military torture, waterboarding. These things became very controversial at the time, but it was imposed. The American government colonial orders imposed, but in this illustration of the time, you see the Philippine donkey has wrapped Uncle Sam around the palm tree of imperialism. Well, this is kind of a pretty difficult history, let's say, but we don't know much about it in our training, but the Filipinos remember it very well. Then Howard Taft was made the colonial governor. He went on to be president. Manila was developed, and there was a lot of infrastructure and different things that came through this brief period of about 50 years before the Japanese came in. And suddenly, at December 8th, 1941, the Japanese Army, Air Force came in, Navy, and then they took Manila quite quickly. We'll go to Manila and go to Corregidor and see many of the monuments of that time. General Yamashita was appointed head of the Philippines, and again went through the same problem of guerrilla warfare from the mountains, and the war quickly turned into a bloodbath with the Bataan death march and a lot of massacres, as we saw today. Then when the Navy and the Allies came in and sank the Japanese fleet, a lot of the biggest battles were right here where we're going. This is at off of Romblon Island, the Battle of Leyte, which to this day is still the world's largest naval engagement in the sense of how many ships and how much damage was done. And then General MacArthur, as he swore, he did come back after having been driven out of the Philippines to liberate the Philippines from the Japanese. But again, not until after a lot of damage was done, particularly in Manila. This is the old town, the Intramuros, which was the last stand for the Japanese, let's say. And so at the end of World War II, much of Manila was in ruins. But peace came, and particularly the head of the Philippine Assembly, Quezon, appeal to President Roosevelt to let his people be free. And of course, Roosevelt's policy is that there were going to be no more colonies in Asia. And it didn't work out for a couple of them, like Vietnam and Indonesia, except by violence. But it was finally decided that the Philippines could be their own nation. So on July 4th, 1946, it was declared the independent nation of the Philippines. The flag was raised, and finally the hopes of the nationalists was fulfilled with a functional democracy, though. It was not a violent revolution, and they had already an assembly. They had fairly comprehensive administrations already in place in spite of all the war and trouble. But notice the seal of the Republic of the Philippines happens to have a lion. I'm not sure what that's for, but it has the American eagle holding the olive branch and the arrows. And so then the Philippines had a lot of democratic problems. This is the first president, Rojas, who, with his wife, set the pattern for, let's say, the president and first lady, and often later the wife would become the president, as in Corazon Aquino after her husband was killed. But the decades went on, and one leader after the other was either assassinated or was corrupt and kicked out. Particularly in the center here in the white is Ferdinand Marcos. This is at an Association of Southeast Asians meeting. We noticed with President Johnson on the other side, and then a couple of the Vietnamese leaders on in this lineup. But Marcos ran this country like his own personal piggy bank. He declared martial law in 1972 and said he was protecting the country from the communists. Well, he was actually pretty much looting the national economy. He was said to have amassed some $1 billion in Swiss bank accounts in his 20-some years as the president, until he was driven out by popular revolt, the People's Revolution, who were particularly angry at his wife, Imelda Marcos, who was, let's say, so stylish. She was sort of I don't know, the nation ridiculed her because she spent so much money, particularly on her shoes. And this pair of her shoes that was today we saw in the museum, supposedly 4,000 pairs of shoes. Well, they were driven out of the palace that they lived in the old Intramuros, the old part of Manila. And when we're there, you can get a tour and see that the old stone walls have been mostly rebuilt. But in there, facing the river, is the presidential palace, the Malangsam Palace, where actually Imelda Marcos had it expanded and renovated and had her great boudoir there. But then the people demonstrations, they were literally chased out of it, and then the public was in and got to see the splendor that they lived in. Well, this was originally a Spanish official's residence. It was then expanded and made into the presidential palace as it is today. And in that old part of Manila, they've restored some of the buildings that were badly damaged. So again, it's a historic district with the heart of the colonial era right still there, this Holy Rosary Seminary, and also the oldest university in the Philippines, San Tomas, from 1611. By the way, they have a very extensive university system via the University of the Philippines, which is all tuition free, and the students get a subsidy if they can apply and qualified to be in the university. So no Filipino goes out of school with that thing called student debt. Well, this is Manila, the Great Bay on the bottom of the map, and the center of the town, but it's spread as a city of maybe 10 to 11 million people now. So when we get there, you'll see that's sort of one of these giant, roaring, rather new cities with gleaming buildings and such, but also very extensive slum quarters for the poor who have immigrated from the countryside to try to get a job in the big city here. That's the National Parliament building, court building, and then all the glass towers that are popping up everywhere. So this is very much the center, political, economic, cultural for the nation, with many districts, particularly Makati and other areas where business has built up a whole new towns. This is a big hospital, St. Luke's, in what they call Global City, and it is a place where it trains many of the medical staff that go around the world. Out on the bay, they have built this big cultural center which features art museums, concert halls, assembly halls, and such. So there's a lot of modern architecture in the recent decades in Manila that's quite striking. This is a big office building. But then the local people are, sort of in the midst of a changing economy, a global economy. One of the largest export items in the Philippines is actually semiconductors and in the electronics industry. But you'll see on the street a lot of people are peddlers and begging, and there's a lot of poor people. The per capita income of the whole country is only about 9,000 US dollars a year. But nonetheless, it's a very animated and colorful place. I always think when you go to the Philippines, you're surprised by how happy and warm and friendly people are, even if they had so little. Well, this is something we even saw today, they call the jeepneys, which were old World War II jeeps from the military that were abandoned, and then they were all fixed up and converted and decorated as sort of a public transport through the cities, so that you can hail them on the main streets in Manila. But out on the countryside, you have this booming population. It's gone from about 5 million in the whole country in the year 1900 to over 100 million now. So the rule of thumb in these countries, they double their population every generation. And so the limited land on the islands mean that more and more people move to Manila. And also as the fishing industry is getting more desperate from overfishing, essentially, you get all these extra people that are cramming into the cities looking for something to do. And so this is a great challenge to the Filipino government. So this Rodrigo Duterte is the current president. I'm sure you've heard about him because he was a mayor in the southern island of Mindanao and Davao. And he's sort of the original, let's say, tough guy, and he swore he would both develop the country but also suppress the drug trade and some of the chaos and political opposition. So, and there has been some serious problems. In the southern island of Mindanao, there have been Islamic terrorists and bombings and battles, pitched battles between the army and the insurgents who wanted to secede from the Philippines and have an Islamic republic in Mindanao. And actually just last month they finally had negotiations and they had a referendum to allow Mindanao and the Muslim communities to be autonomous and keep control, particularly of their finances. And so that has now passed, and now this whole problem of the clash of the Islam and Christianity may sort of diminish after all these centuries of trouble with it. The other current problem is, of course, the issues in the South China Sea, or as they call it here, the West Philippine Sea, with the limits to, let's say, fishing, first of all, but also the access to the reefs out off the shore here. So here's just a map of the archipelago waters, the exclusive waters, but then the economic zone under UN international agreement extend out 200 miles. The problem is in the Scarborough Reef off to the west of Luzon, that's where the Chinese again have come in and they've built reefs into islands and put stations, and now they call it their own. You see, Taiwan is just up on the north of there, so the neighbors are maybe not getting along so well, but they have to. As President Rojas, when he met Zhou Enlai at a conference in the 1950s, and Zhou Enlai, the Chinese foreign minister, says, well, good to meet you, we are neighbors. And Rojas answered, no, we are only geographically neighbors, otherwise we share very little in common. Well, they share the sea in common, and they have to figure out a way to, let's say, live together and not have territorial ambitions on each other. The other thing that's just recently happened is the return of the Balanga Bells, which were church bells that were taken as a prize by American troops back in the Philippine insurrection and taken all the way to, I believe it was at West Point, and they were sort of one of the prizes of that particular conflict. And the Philippine government has always said, please just give us back the bells as a token of friendship after all this trouble and all these years. So just this last year, they were brought back, and to great national, let's say, happiness that they were finally back, and they were now reinstalled at the little church on Panay where they were taken. The other thing that's going on is this terrible drug war The Philippines, like some other parts of Asia, are awash in heroin and methamphetamines, and in the poorer areas, it's a serious condition. And I took this picture just today because this is such an issue for the Filipinos. First of all, the toll that the drug trade takes, but also the toll that the police and army are taking as they go marching in, and then they just round up whoever they suspect, and then they've had approximately 10,000 killings, whether they are legal or not, whether there was resistance, but it's not unlike what's going on in parts of Brazil, if not in other countries. So this is, again, a very painful issue for the Filipino people. They don't want to, let's say, condone the drug trade, but on the other hand, they don't condone the way that Duterte has just said he's going to kill them all. But most people are not involved in that, and particularly for all these youth, you have, they say about 1 million young people a year have coming into the labor market, but what are they going to do? The Philippines has such limited space and employment. So the Philippines has been now world famous because of the training academies will train, these are young merchant mariners, and it's about half of the world's commercial fleet has Filipino sailors on it, engineers, deck officers, able-bodied seamen. And this ship is an example. It could not operate without our Filipino friends. So these academies turn out thousands of employees, also in medical staff, and also in, let's say, hospitality industry, chefs, and again, you can appreciate that's on this ship. In the Philippine government, they call them the heroes of the nation because there are almost 10 million Filipinos who are working abroad, from the Middle East to the Americas to Europe and places. And they send back billions of dollars a year to keep this economy going and keep the health of the nation. So when you see these young people walking around, they're often in school, like the ones we had today. They were very polite and spoke good English, and they were happy to see us. And so that's the nature of the country. And we'll get a little more taste of it as we go along, the different variety of cuisine, which is sort of a mix between Spanish and some Chinese, like spring rolls, and some Malay dishes, and lots of different things. But they say there's such a variety of people, variety of cultures, and variety of food here. This is the famous halo, which is made from rice gelatin, along with custard, along with coconut flakes, along with other toppings. You can sort of make it to order however you like it. And then spicy chicken, the adobo chicken, that's their national dish, that and rice. But I don't want you to get you too hungry, because we have to have a drink first. Then the other thing is all the dancing and music. You saw today at the pier, the place, before we even got here, they were all up and dancing. And this is such a Filipino thing. They'll take any excuse to get up and do a show. They're very animated people that way, and so much more cheerful than what you can see in, well, you can name the other places. A lot of it is either ethnically based or Spanish style, or now it's line dancing or hip hop or whatever it is. It's just an animated population, and maybe for lack of other opportunities, they just have a fiesta. But most famous are all these big religious festivals where they'll bring out the town cathedrals, saints or Virgin Mary, and they'll have the penitent days, and they'll have this ecstatic religious processions. And that's why the Pope always comes to the Philippines, because he often has the greatest of receptions around the world to celebrate the saints' days and such. And other things are even more curious. This is at a festival where I found this picture of a mask of a two-faced, three-eyed Spanish conquistador, which must be an actual accurate depiction of him. But there's a festival on the island of Negros called Atihan, which is done at about this time of year, where they have sort of a festival of lights, sort of like Diwali or Chinese New Year, but they all dress up in, I would say, carnival-style decorations, and then they imitate the original indigenous inhabitants. So this goes on for days, and I went there, and the music was going literally in a big drum sets for 3 days while everybody danced in the street, very much like a Mardi Gras. Well, here's one of the young writers here who says the identity of the Filipinos is based upon their maritime culture, their variety of history, their variety of people. and especially he's trying to protect the natural environment. And a colleague of his wrote this in a book called Viajero, or The Traveler. His name is Sionil Jose. And he says, "Who am I as a Filipino? I look at my reflection in the pool and I see a brown man with an inquiring face, eager to know, to taste all the juices of the earth. I come upon myself not knowing where from I came. I do suspect it was not from some eternal womb or the hollow of bamboo or the sky. But I'm alone, yet I know there are likenesses of me with all the same bone and muscle and hungers that cannot be satisfied. I must also stand alone, for this is what all people must do if they are going to prevail in the human wilderness. And I was made to wander. If I had wings, I would have soared to the highest. My wings could take me in the sky. But with my feet, I must now go as far as I can as they lead me. And I've seen this face, and it belongs only to me, but then I also recognize it everywhere. For it is the face of a traveler, a seeker, and even if he moves not a muscle or an eye, for the mind is what travels farther than what the flesh with all its frailty can reach. But where will I go, and what will I become?" And so that's maybe the question that this young woman is Googling on her phone. Again, I took this picture today. And so particularly this flood of young people are facing a future which is perhaps not so violent as in the wars and troubles of the past, but just the struggle of our modern global economy. And all we can do is wish them well and enjoy our time here in the Philippines, which is always a surprise wherever we go. And with that, I would wish you mabuhay, which is the Filipino welcome, and have a great trip here. Thank you very much.